Right, so here we are, Burgundy Unpicked, and this is going to be a little bit of a scene-setting episode because we're going to look at the vintage as a whole. I'm delighted to be joined by Head of Fine Wine Buying, Guy Seddon.
Hi, Will. Thank you.
And by Head of Monopole, Joseph Muller.
Hello, Will. Feels a bit weird being on this side of the table.
Well, I know, but someone's got to take control of this thing. So anyway, so we're talking about 24 Burgundy, and I think what would be great is that we will try and follow up over the coming weeks and months with the releases. They're already, hopefully by the time you hear this, a Domaine Leflaive pod out. But yeah, we'll go through the domains as we release them. But it's good, I think, to set the scene. And Guy's done a vintage report, which you'll be able to find on the website and we'll be sending out. But it's, I think, well, certainly the way I learn, I'd be far better off hearing it from a podcast than trying to make myself read it and digest it through my eyes. So, Guy, 2024 Burgundy from your, well, three trips and one small one. So, yeah.
Yep. Okay. Thanks, Will. Well, I started tasting the white wines back in the summer in July, and then went one more time in autumn. So, in the sort of first week of October. And then the final trip with Joe was just recently, 2 weeks ago. So that was the last week of November. Mm-hmm. So yeah, a decent overview of the season. And we were tasting some 23s, but almost all of them were 24s. So yeah, a few scene setting things then about the vintage. I mean, what you may have heard or read about in the press is that 24 was a cool season. For those of you who remember the UK summer in 2024, or maybe lack of summer, it was a little wet, and certainly those conditions were also felt in Burgundy. So what we're looking at is a more traditional set of growing conditions. It was cooler, it was wetter, and yeah, the temperatures really didn't get up to the heights that we've seen in 23 and 20 and 22. You know, so we've had some really warm, in inverted commas, climate change years, and I was going to describe 24 as a non-climate change vintage, but I think, you know, without going too deeply into it, it probably is in its own way the result of climate change. But sometimes you get these slightly more extreme manifestations, and having a very cool summer, I think, is part and parcel of our changing climate. But anyway, the wines themselves split into whites and reds with different personalities for both. So the first thing that should be said is that there was mildew, so that affected the quantities. So I think on the white side of things, it wasn't quite as badly affected, but the red wines have been quite badly compromised in terms of volumes by mildew, and that's led to two different characters, I suppose, in the whites versus the reds. The whites are wonderful. I mean, they are going to number some of the stars of the vintage among them. And I think they have this real backbone of freshness around which is built a very nice density and intensity of fruit. And so they really have both aspects. They've got this kind of core of acidity to them, but they've got a notch more density to them than the 21s had, for example. So I think in terms of comparable vintages, you're maybe thinking in terms of 14s, maybe with a little less kind of aggressive acid tension to them, or you're thinking of 17s with that lovely kind of friendly accessibility of quite old school fruit. For the reds, the fruit character is maybe a sort of notch less. There is a really nice terroir transparency to the wines. The beautiful aromas, the wines of beautiful perfume and very drinkable. I think on the red side of things, we're going to be drinking our 23s and probably even 22s after we drink the 24s. So, you know, 24 does have this accessibility to it. And I think that will allow us to give those sort of older 22s and 23s a little bit more cellar time while we wait for them to come round. So in terms of the season, without going through it blow by blow, the two things to mention are that at flowering, there was some rain, and that caused what's known as coulure. So it's essentially not all of the flowers on the vines ended up turning into berries. So that had a knock-on effect on volumes, and the quantity of the crop rather than the quality of the crop was affected at that point. And then afterwards, due to the cool nature of the vintage, with moisture in the atmosphere, you then did have downy mildew developing, and that's something that affects the grapes. It also affects the leaves, and so has a knock-on effect on photosynthesis, and it can affect the stems as well, which has led to people doing less things like whole bunch fermentation afterwards. So that's led to some different winemaking choices. It's definitely led to a lot of work in the vineyards.
Yeah.
You really had to be in the vines constantly during the 24 growing season, and especially producers who work in organics, they work with sprays that adhere, as it were, to the leaves and the berries, but then when you get another episode of rain, it all gets washed off and you have to get back out there and start again. So it was a really intense period of vineyard work, and I think that sort of took its toll on vineyard teams and on their sort of capacity to deal with it. But that's where you see the division into the domains that we are lucky enough to work with, and people who have enough resource to get out there and fight these natural conditions, and people who maybe struggle a little bit with that side of things. So it was really a vintage that was won in the vineyards and then on the sorting table. And then, the character of the wines themselves at the best estates were wonderful. So, I think, Joe, we both came back from our recent tasting with smiles on our faces, didn't we?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, just one point on your 3 trips, how different, again, you don't taste at the same estates each of the 3 times as a sort of control. But is there a big difference between going in sort of September and going in November, do you find?
Yeah, there is. And that's why our July trip focused only on the white wines, because I think it's essentially a bit too early to be tasting Pinot Noir at that stage. Okay. Some people are even reticent about you going in October. I think they feel that, given the extra month, the wines do show that much better from barrel in November. And we tasted at one domain in both October and November, and I think that did bear out, actually. I think there was a bit of a difference. I mean, you never quite know. When you're tasting barrel samples, it's only ever a snapshot in time. So you can maybe have a very different character coming through on 1 week to the next week even. And, it depends whether the wine's been racked, whether it's been sulfured, whether, it's been moved in some way. And even on the day of the week, the atmospheric pressure, where you are in the biodynamic calendar, if you subscribe to that sort of thing. So definitely at this stage, to ever think that you can get to a sort of definitive judgment on the character of the wines is tough. But yes, the longer you can leave them, the better the character will show itself. Yeah.
And Joe, with you having obviously spoken to Guy about what he'd found the first couple of trips, how did you find the wines? But also, were they different from what you expected at all, given that what you knew about the season?
Yes, I think that is definitely the case. I'm probably not alone on this. I think many of our customers and some of the occasional listeners on here would have, already looked into how the growing season is. Everything's so transparent now, so instant. Instagram. Everything is publicized when a hailstorm will come in or the temperatures drop to -5. Incredible, downpours sort of smother vineyards and things. So everyone kind of, gets all that feed straight away. And I think with 24 having a lot of the press about, it's rain. And, look, rain is clearly a significant feature of the vintage. And, one grower said that actually, the amount of rain they had in 24 was more than 22 and 23 combined. So, clearly that's going to have an impact. And so you go there with a sort of whether it's a preconception or not, or I always try to go with more of an open mind. But I was delighted with the outcome. And the reason being, yes, there's obviously the quantities are brutally low, and particularly for red, Pinot Noir really suffered with through other cure and the effects of disease and therefore sorting, and those are down to almost sort of 90% in some places.
Yeah, they are. I mean, I'll give a couple of examples just for illustration. But I mean, Christophe Paramino, for example, who we now work with exclusively, based in Maurice-Saint-Denis, but all of his holdings are in the Côte de Nuits, and he normally makes 35,000 bottles. He made 9,500 bottles in 24. And just one other, so Domaine de Lalo, based in Nuits Saint-Georges, which is again one of the epicenters of the mildew pressure. Their largest vineyard is Clos de Forêt Saint-Georges, which is a Premier Cru, and they harvested that at 3 hectolitres per hectare.
Oh,
yeah. So tiny.
Tiny, yeah. And look, so the Côte de Nuits suffered more. The Côte de Beaune with the whites fared better, but again, it's all dependent on specific sites and ultimately how that sort of growing season has played out within those vines. But it's a belle surprise. There's a beautiful surprise about the vintage, because I go there and I'm thinking, right, okay, so we know we've had a lot of rain. We know we haven't had that much sunshine. So, and we're talking about luminosity as well as warmth. So, a lot of that's been cut off for a big
By which
part.
you mean the amount of light?
Yeah, direct light to help the phenolics in their skins particularly sort of evolve and within the grape. And so you're there going, okay, so I'm going to start this. And I've tried a few 24s here in London prior to going out. So you think, okay, this is going to be a lot of acid, definitely. Probably going to be quite crunchy, quite sour. And with the reds, like, what's that tannin profile going to be like? And they're probably going to be quite angular, and they're going to be quite sort of beefy. And there's really, okay, because of the extremities, if you like, for want of a better word, there is some inconsistencies. This is not a homogeneous vintage in terms of overall style, where everyone delivered a certain style of Pinot and Chardonnay. There is obviously some range of quality, but the people who work their vineyards with genuine fastidious care and attention, and who are in tune in the winery with vintages like this, because you need to pivot. As Guy said, some people have just done no destemming. I know some people were forced to use stems. De Vague, for example, there is no whole bunch, which was all about Jean-Luc Patelli's philosophy. But people can make the right calls based on that. And those who are very closely linked to their terroir, to their land, have come up with some glorious wines. And they're glorious because of the vintage. So it's a sort of a victory and a triumph over challenge and adversity. But where the surprise was, there is genuine concentration in the wines, which I didn't expect. I thought they were going to be slightly lightweight, and that that concentration comes from a brilliant level of ripeness of fruit. Again, I thought this was going to be what was really, really lacking, but there is a genuine sucrosity there, and it's following one of the warmest vintages and one of the most sort of sweetest in terms of ripeness levels that we've had before with 23. And 22 on both whites and reds, and the whites maybe slightly accelerate, but the best reds had this beautiful level of almost where the fruit is. I like to think of that perfect point where the skins have got a little bit of bite, but the flesh underneath is beautifully sweet, and you get that combination of acid jumping out into you, but then you've also got that lovely level of sweetness.
So I know there's one domain you're desperate to talk about, and I won't stand in your way there by any means, but just to flesh out that a little bit. So, I mean, there was this window of opportunity in the summer, and you had the sort of August in particular going into September a little bit. And there was above average sunshine, and there was this sort of breezy weather, which kept the vines healthy. It allowed photosynthesis to take place, and the lighter load of crop on the vines actually meant that the berries that were there received a lot of nutrients and a lot of goodness. So you had this quite rapid acceleration of ripeness in the sort of peak of the summer, which was in August. And, a couple of examples. I mean, Jean Orsoni at Puy de Los, one of our new exclusivities, said we didn't expect having this very complete phenolic maturity, and they made a tiny crop, but what they made was really beautiful in terms of character. And Jean-Luc Patelli, who Joe's mentioned at De Vogue, new winemaker and general head honcho there, who was great guy to be working with, said very small yields helped us to get beautiful ripeness. So there is this this payoff. The fact that you've got such a small crop on the vine meant that it was actually quite easy during the month of August to get proper ripeness.
Yeah, I mean, I can also testify to the maturity. I've mentioned in another pod briefly, but I was in Burgundy in September 24, early September, with some customers. We went to do some visits. It was a great time to go because the vineyards were obviously in full sort of swing in growth. Okay, look, you could see the presence of mildew there. But when we were there for 3 days, and 2 of them were blue skies and a lovely temperature, The breeze you mentioned was certainly there as well, which is a big benefit. And we just went into some of the vineyards and just, popped a few grapes into our mouths just to taste them. And they were genuinely sweet. And again, I sort of thought almost, this is going to be real sort of crunchy, and they're going to be quite, the pips are going to be quite large, and that's going to give a real tannic presence. It's going to influence. But there was a lovely sweetness there. So I know I was going with this trip on Guy, and beforehand I maybe had some preconceptions, but I also had that little seed planted back from my experience, thinking, I'm intrigued to see how these particular, that was Pinot I tasted then. I didn't taste any Chardonnay from the vines, but I'm glad to say it's kind of, played out how it did within that sort of small taste. Sweetness, a little bit of bite, but the tannins is the other thing I'd like to sort of comment on in terms of the surprise from the Pinots, because as I mentioned, that sucrosity, that concentration, which is meant texture within wines, the tannins are beautifully, and especially again, going to the better level of Domaines, and, that's not to be rude about anything else, they are so fine. And it doesn't matter if they're powdery. It doesn't matter if they're supportive and they're just really the framework, or if they're completely integrated into a much more sort of juicier feel, because some of these Pinots were juicy. There were some people where it wasn't even, there's sort of almost support holding up of acid. It was just interplaying brilliantly. But the tannins they just integrated seamlessly on some of them. And that was a huge surprise. But you're still there, but you just know that that's going to allow really probably quite an open style of Pinot from an early age, but also give it the necessary ingredients to age as well.
There was none of, or very little of, that sort of sense of excess grip that you get sometimes when you're tasting from barrel. Sometimes it's really quite hard work and your gums are sticking together and stuff, but none of that this year. Yeah. And also no real sort of acidity, sort of making your teeth hurt and stuff. So I mean, both of those structural elements were actually quite harmonious this year.
Yeah, because the cynics and the naysayers will want to leap to trying to spot green characters in the Pinots, for examples. And this is not like, where you had in the early days of 4 and the early days of 11. And I might add, with a lot of 11s, they have actually gone from
very true.
But in this early stage, there's no greenness at all. This is a cool vintage and a wetter vintage, but let's make sure we're sort of bringing it into focus. This is against the big, hot, sunnier solar years that we're so accustomed to.
Yeah, but it sounds like the fact that there was less fruit, full stop, as you said exactly, God. The fact that there was actually allowed the whole thing to kind of work. It just means we've been sacrificed at the altar of volume, basically.
Yeah. One was a nick for the other,
which is a frustration, of course.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, no, I think it sounds like an exciting one. Our campaign, as you know, is obviously going to go on over the course of 2, 3, 4 months. So it's going to be very interesting to see from domain to domain. But if you had to name, Mr. Miller, you've missed you were given an own goal to kick into by Mr. Seddon there.
No, I knew you were going to tee up. Don't worry.
Well, okay, but no, going to go back to Mr. Seddon first. And were there positive surprises from you as to any particular domain?
No, I mean, I think everybody who I hoped would perform really did perform. There was nobody who deviated either negatively or positively. I think it's a year in which I'm pleased to say that all of our growers have done an exceptionally good job. There was nobody that I felt had underperformed. And I know Joe wants to mention one that we feel especially overperformed. So, yeah.
Well, no, I'm actually going to typical Joe. I'm going to mention 3 names here. But the first one, just because I just want to go back to just a slight sort of generalization on the vintage, just to help give people an idea.
Can you name a specific domain and have a generalization?
No, before I get to that.
Oh, okay.
So, in style, these 24s for Pinot, I think you can be very forgiving, or you can be forgiven to sort of view them as 21s a little bit on steroids. So the beauty about 21 Reds is, which a lot of people are experiencing now, particularly if you're going to Burgundy and you're going to the restaurant scene there, they're the ones that people are buying. Because it used to be 17s, it used to be 19s, it's now 21s because there's this lovely approachability. You've got this approachability, but you've got so much more concentration. You've got so much more
sort of substance.
Yeah, exactly, fleshy and stuffing on the wines. And so because of that, there is going to be, I think, an earlier drinking, lovely character to these wines. And because of that, the one that I wanted to particularly name was Chateau de la Tour. I really, really enjoyed the Clos de Vougeot, but also their Premier Cru in both Beaune and the Gevrey Village. They did use stems, and clearly got ripeness in those stems because there's a lovely sort of spicy, exotic element which supports them, especially at those at that Premier Cru level. The second point I'd like to sort of say as a tip is that I think at village level and Premier Cru level, the overall quality is above its usual station. The Grand Crus,
you were saying this the other day.
Yeah, and the Grand Crus, I think, with the Great Domaines, you've got no problem there at all. But we've tried Grand Crus from where some domains they only have 1 or 2 parcels, and it's not what they really focus on. And you can sort of see that there may be a little bit lightweight for what Grand Cru should be. So what I'm getting at is when you do come to sort of start buying Burgundy with 24, you need to have a really good communication with your merchant, because there's also then the actions of other people that they've taken.
When you say your merchant, you mean Corny Barrow.
Of course I do, yeah. But one I want to lead on to is Dugat P. I was blown away with the quality here from the off, like his Bourgogne Alinard and his Bourgogne Pinot. I mean, that's my tasting note for that word starts off with "Hello!" ! Is
it me you're looking for?
And because what Loic has managed to do is get, for me, like the most beautiful textures in his wines. He's destemmed all his Village and Bourgogne, but he's used stem in Premier Cru and Grand Cru, which straddles the sort of the fruit component that he's managed to achieve in both his whites and reds brilliantly, but particularly his reds. There is no sort of rough edges. It's all about refinement and using Gevrey power when you get to the sort of the Domaines older vines. The benefit of those old vines there, but guiding it in the most majestic manner. It sort of leads me to sort of think personally, do I prefer his wines in the slightly non-stereotypically knockout of the park brilliant vintages? Quite possibly.
I think it's easier to see the structure underneath, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like that. And he's it was interesting talking to winemakers, because some people say, "Oh, it was such a difficult year," and he just seems totally unfazed by the whole thing. He was like, "Yeah, well, we made smaller quantities, but you just do the work you have to do."
Yeah, exactly.
So,
10 to 15 hectoliters on his red, 15 for his white. 12 treatments. And his, as we know, he is one with the vineyard. As in, he's a Tressage man, and he adopted it after his dad when he went solo. 15 and 17 onwards shows the real rewards of what he's been doing.
Fastidiousness, but
yeah.
Well, look, I think that's absolutely brilliant. We'll be publishing the calendar and Guy's vintage report, but I think for today, from Mr. Seddon and his wonderful comments on the vintage, and Mr. Muller and his waffle, that's probably more than enough.
Yep, I could waffle on for so much longer.
But believe me, we know, having heard most of it before. But anyway, from me, that's a goodbye, and I hope you listen up again soon.
Yeah, goodbye from me. Thank you.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thanks very much. Cheers, Will.